Hey, we are going live. All right. Dr. Blomberg, it is a delight to have you here with us today. Thanks so much for joining us for this live Q&A. My name is Natasha Fish. I am the board chair for Be Emboldened. We just are in the process of rebranding and have announced our name and logo, so you can go to beemboldened.com to check out our new site, which is really exciting. Today's topic, our live stream, is on what the spiritually abusive churches don't want you to know about tithing and divorce. Two very simple topics. And so I'm so thankful we have Dr. Blomberg with us today to answer these questions. I will be emceeing, hosting, asking the questions. Dr. Blomberg will be answering. So feel free to put in the chat your questions now. We have some already, but go ahead and type those in so that we can get to those today in the next 30 minutes, 45 minutes or so. And of course, we will, answer as many as we can before the end of our time. So Dr. Blomberg, I'd love to hear from you just a little bit, like, why is this topic so important? Why are we addressing this today?
Well, I take it that it's important for your ministry because you have a lot of listeners and people who have experienced this kind of abuse. These are just two of a number of topics that could fall under that umbrella. They are areas that I have both researched extensively and written on, so I'm sure that's why I was invited to do the two previous shows, one on each topic, and then we thought we would throw it open for Q&A. But there isn't necessarily anything unique about these two topics when put side by side with many other things that a very authoritarian church that wants to control its members and have them see and encounter things only from their unique perspective. There are a lot of other issues that we could be addressing similarly, sadly.
Yeah, and we do, right? Like, that's the point of these live streams, of the content that we're producing, is there's so many topics to talk about and address, and tithing and divorce are two heavy hitters. So we are so glad to have you here and your expertise. If you guys don't know, Dr. Blomberg is a faculty of Denver Seminary. He's a distinguished professor of the New Testament and has specialized in parables, the writings of Luke through Acts. He studied at the Aberdeen University in Scotland, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's just an incredible resource, and we're so thankful to have him on here. He's written so many works and edited 20 books, so he's got quite a lot to add here. So I'm excited to dive in. As Dr. Blomberg mentioned, he did a recording talking about these two topics with Naomi. Those have not been released yet with the rebranding and some other things going on. We've kind of had to reorganize how we're releasing things. So those are coming. So be on the lookout for those great conversations. I've been able to listen to them, and they're just fabulous. So, but we're getting to the Q&A today, which is great because it's just really special to have this opportunity to do this live. So with that, we'll jump in, Dr. Blomberg, with our first question. How do you overcome an environment where the majority of opinions... Oh, sorry, this was the wrong question from a different live stream. Let me back up a little bit here. All right, let's start with a tithing question. How should churches use their tithe offerings? We can talk about a lot of bad examples, but what is the actual model or prescribed way that a church should use their tithe offering, so we can maybe compare that to what's happening in reality and see, hey, that's not lining up. So Dr. Blomberg, how should churches use their tithe offerings?
It seems only appropriate that if a church is going to ask its members to give generously, that it would model that. And so what we talked a lot about on the previous broadcast is that there is no fixed percentage in the New Testament. And if you try to carry Old Testament teaching over, you wind up asking people to give 23 1/3%, which isn't usually what churches have in mind when they say that. But an obvious example of how a church can, in essence, model the same kind of giving is in its missions budget, in its giving to help the needy locally. There are things called benevolence funds. Some churches call them deacons funds. But if we say that for most middle class or above congregations, individuals could, in many instances, do much more than just 10%, and that whatever they may be currently giving, a great model is what's been called the graduated tithe, where you start at a certain amount and then you try to increase that percentage on a perhaps annual basis. Then that's a great model for churches as well. I was part of a very large church for a number of years that began at 20% of its budget for missions, and over a period of about 5 years was in the process of 1% a year, increasing that to 25. And they still had plenty of expenses for a building and for a staff, but where there is a common commitment among people, where there's been good teaching and good modeling, you can do something like that. And then you have to be careful too that what comes under that area really qualifies as such. There are, unfortunately, in a number of congregations, people who are supported in the name of either foreign or local missions, who are not doing much more, if at all, than what a layperson volunteering actively in the church could do. And so one has to ask, what should the church target out of many good possible ministries that really meets spiritual and physical needs of the least evangelized and the most impoverished people at home and abroad?
So it sounds like there's a lot of ways to tithe. There's a lot of ways that churches can be using their money for good. There's not just these are the ways you have to do it. There's an aspect of generosity. Can you talk about the difference between tithing and generosity? Are those two things different? And how does that play into what you just shared about how a church should be using their tithe offerings?
Yeah. No offense, but you're doing what a lot of people do in the English language, and that is you're using tithing as a synonym for giving. But the word tithing actually means to give 10%. So I try to encourage people to use the word only in the context of when somebody is talking about a belief that a person should give 10% to something. To say, well, I tithe 7% is a logical contradiction. It's like saying, I give presents to half of my 10 relatives, and that's 2 of them. I mean, it's mathematically impossible. So tithes and offerings is Old Testament language. It comes out of Malachi. It has a long history of the church, and all it does is confuse people. So I would abolish that language and just talk about we are to give generously, and a significant part of that ought to be to a local church. If we can't support what the local church is doing with our money, then we should find a church where we can. But there is nothing that says all our giving should go to one church. There are many good Christian ministries, and some of them in positions to do things that churches can't always do well, that deserve our support also.
Yeah. Now, would you say that a congregant, someone who is giving, tithing towards a church, that they have a right to know what the church is doing with those funds?
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't mean that depending on the context, you necessarily publish in detail line item expenditures, but certainly church members not only have the right, but the church has the responsibility to let them know, here are the kinds of things, here is the budget overall, how much goes to staff salaries, how much goes to physical upkeep if there's a building they're in charge of, how much goes to people outside of our fellowship, and so forth. And then if it's not published in detail, it should be accessible, where someone can say, perhaps it's an executive pastor in a larger church, a business manager, I would like to make an appointment to sit down with somebody and see the details. That is just standard part of congregational church polity.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. If there's anyone out there listening who maybe has had someone say, oh, that's knowledge not for you, or that's maybe just hidden or secretive in any way, that potentially could be a red flag for you. If you're checking out a church or you're part of a group that you may suspect is unhealthy, pay attention to that. If there is a secrecy about where money is going, that could be a sign that maybe if there's some unhealth in that group there. So let's bounce to the divorce topic here. We're kind of going to go a little bit back and forth, a little table tennis, if you will. So someone asks here, I'm dating someone who is part of an unhealthy religious group. I really love this person and want to marry her, and she's okay with me not being part of the group. Is entering into marriage with her unwise? Will we be at risk, significant risk for divorce because of this?
Yes. I've watched this so often, and there are occasionally some very happy stories of one person who is deeply committed to another whose entire religion or version of a religion or religious commitments in some way or another create a bad mix. And over time and with love, and where there is open, honest communication, people see the light, people come to Jesus. That does not happen very often. However, I would want to hear not simply that she's okay with the other person doing something different. I would want to hear that the two of them are engaged in a process of ongoing conversation, with the goal being that they will find one place they can agree on and be together at before there is ever a marriage, before there is ever the possibility of what do we do with children, who unfortunately, as in so many cases where parents aren't on the same page, are the ones who suffer the most.
It's really wise to be aware of the consequences of those decisions and how they can play out long term. So yeah, pump the brakes and maybe have those conversations before you dive into a committed relationship like marriage. That's great. Thanks, Dr. Blomberg. Is there kind of along this topic again of divorce and maybe reasons for divorce, as you guys will hear, in the conversation with Dr. Blomberg, and as probably many people are talking about now, abuse is a potential reason for divorce. But we're specifically, focusing on maybe spiritual abuse as an aspect of that dynamic. So, is there any reference to spiritual abuse in marriages in the Bible? Is this a new thing that we're talking about that, may be a reason for divorce, or is there any kind of tie to spiritual abuse happening in marriages in the Bible?
There is not any explicit reference. One can certainly read, especially in the Old Testament, numerous contexts where it seems like one often winds up turning to King David because of his many relationships, but his wouldn't be the only instances where you see examples of unhealthiness and what might, in today's psychological language, be considered abuse. But that's what makes this issue so difficult. There is clear reference to permission to divorce in the case of marital unfaithfulness, what we call adultery. There's clear reference in the case of an unbelieving partner who wants to leave and not remain. And there would be some who would generalize from that and say, in any case of willful abandonment. But whether you're talking about physical or spiritual abuse, despite what you might hear from respected leaders, there just is not anything that allows us to take that issue in any of its forms and say, right, here's a third clear-cut, no-brainer, we don't have to think about it example. Does that mean it's always wrong to divorce for some kind of abuse? No. And again, the previous podcast goes into quite a bit of detail on that whole topic. But to answer the question that you asked, are there biblical examples of this that we can clearly say, yeah, that's a case of it? No, we can't. Is it a new issue in society? Heavens, no. With the ways that women have been treated in much more patriarchal cultures throughout history, what today would be called both physical and or spiritual abuse has probably been far more commonplace in other eras of human history, and still in some parts of the world today than in the West.
Wow. Do you have any insight or experience into outside of the West? What kind of spiritual abuse happens in marriages? Or
well, without wanting to incur the wrath of particular religions that one knows are easily defensive and then offensive about such things, the more that you have a religion that denies women the same rights as men, I don't think in today's world I have to name names of particular religions, the greater the chance there is for spiritual abuse to be tucked in together with all of the other privileges, quote unquote, that are seemingly reserved for men. If God speaks to men, including fathers and husbands, about his will for wives and daughters, as is often claimed in various circles, then there certainly is the possibility of a man taking that responsibility very seriously and very lovingly and doing the best he can for the women under him. But that's not the common scenario. It's very difficult, requires a lot of self-sacrifice on the part of the man, which in those subcultures usually is not what they're being told to cultivate. So I'm afraid everyone in a difficult situation tends to feel like I have it worse than anybody else in the history of the world. But outside of Christian and pseudo-Christian circles, I'm afraid things can get a lot worse and have gotten a lot worse.
Yeah. Well, that certainly brings in, like you said, the conversation about men and women. And in fact, I'm going to add a link in our chat here, just our playlist of live streams. Our first topic back in October was about women and the biblical truth about women with Dr. Helene Dallaire. So encourage you all to check that out. If you're curious more about what Dr. Blomberg was referencing, that's a great live stream and content there to kind of resource you in that way. So thanks for that helpful insight, Dr. Blomberg. Back to tithing. We may have already answered this, so you can say check if that's applicable. But we do have a specific question here. Where is the accountability for churches in regards to the offerings they collect?
Yeah, I don't think we have talked about that. And the more a church is independent, the more that it is not a part of a denomination or even a fellowship of like-minded churches, in general, the less likely there is any accountability. I've often had conversations with people who say, well, you can't find any denominations in Scripture, and that's what's fractured Christianity into so many competing groups. And I agree 100%. Simply starting one more independent church that's not tied to any denomination, however, is not helping to solve the problem. It's exacerbating it. If we started to find ways of cooperating across church lines and even merging various like-minded fellowships and moving toward unity, then that would help that problem. But in today's world, with all of the strictures that we have, I think one of the strongest arguments for being a part of a healthy and fairly large Christian denomination, one of the established ones, is because most of the time, not always, but most of the time, there is an accountability within that. Churches are not simply free to do anything they want. Some of that accountability that the questioner is asking about can therefore be addressed.
Yeah, that's really good. We didn't plan this, I promise, but we actually just talked about denominations as well. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that, you can click on that link. Dr. Roger Olson, recently retired professor, we talked about what's the deal with Christian denominations and what should we know about them. So really good point, but really great to see, a strength that comes from how denominations are set up is the level of accountability that can exist in that. And that helps with all kinds of topics and issues, but specifically with where money is going and how tithing and offerings are being used. Great. Kind of along those lines too, just talking about where money is going. What is a fair salary for a church worker, a pastor? Should a pastor make six figures, etc.?
Well, every answer to that question that gets preserved, whether through a recording or in print, is out of date tomorrow, because the economics of our world is is always changing. Is it appropriate for a pastor of a very large and healthy and maybe multiple site congregation with located in one of the parts of, if we're talking about the United States, with one of the higher costs of living, with the kinds of responsibilities that are usually expected of them, to make up to $100,000, it may well be. I certainly have known very godly men who themselves modeled generous giving. And if you give somebody 100,000, they may be able to model giving 20 or 25,000 of that away. I've known men who have done that. So it's hard to ever put a dollar figure. Questions that ought to be asked, somewhat along the lines of all the people who are appropriately upset about the seemingly outrageous salaries of some CEOs compared to every other level of even executives, to say nothing of the standard workforce, is, do you do that? Do you pay a senior pastor what in a local context seems like a very large and generous salary at the expense of all the other staff? Is nobody else making more than 50,000 if there is full-time staff? And is there really that much difference in the responsibilities of those individuals? If it is a large church and there are support staff or non-pastoral staff, administrative people, are they being compensated also in a way, presuming they live in that same area with a high cost of living, or are they just barely eking by? Does the church or ministry go out of its way to hire people at 38 or 39 hours, or now I guess it's 28 or 29 hours a week, to avoid them being considered full-time and therefore have to give them perks? Those are the awkward questions we ought to be asking.
Yeah. So really, it depends. And
yeah,
there's a lot of follow-up questions to be asking. Now, what if someone maybe is noticing some discrepancy or seeing some potential issues here with how money is being used, or the fairness between who's getting a salary and how much? Do you have any wisdom for someone who's noticing that, what they should do in that very awkward position?
Yeah, that's so hard, and it varies from one situation to the next. If you have the sense that people are simply caught up in this is what we see others doing, this is the way we've always done it, this there doesn't seem to be a sort of willful misuse, and one can and one is involved and one is viewed as a trustworthy person and generally loyal. There can be all kinds of ways to find those who are friends and sympathetic to just ask questions and say, help me out here. What's going on? This is how somebody from the outside like me could superficially see things. Is there another side I ought to understand, and so forth? And there usually are other factors. And when you ask that of a variety of people, independently, innocuously, you can begin to tell if people just immediately get defensive, or if they're willing to have a conversation with you. I served 2 3-year terms on the elder board of a large church in the 90s and in the 2000s that overall was very healthy, very generous. And just because of the sheer size and the mechanisms needed to deal with size and complexity, there was a lot that only the elders knew about, and sometimes even an executive committee of the elders. But I don't know of any situation where somebody would come to one of us with serious questions that we wouldn't try to sit down and say, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. We may not have made the best decisions. We're open to input. Give us your input. We'll take it into account. Doesn't mean we'll do what you ask, because somebody else is going to ask the exact opposite. But that's a very different situation than where somebody is repeatedly told, no, don't ask those questions. No, this is not proper. It's not appropriate for you to know this or even want to know it. And you start hearing that kind of thing, then those should be your red flags.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We've talked about that in many ways of how an organization or a leader handles being asked questions in respectful ways, of course. We never want to be badgering or intimidating in asking our questions. But if someone cannot answer and engage in a healthy, positive way in a conversation, with someone bringing up a question, that's a red flag. That's something to pay attention to and look into and see if this is really an okay place to be or not. So we've talked a lot about tithing and offering and giving financially. There can also be a big pressure for volunteering, our other resources, right? Our time, our talents, our money. Those are all part of what we have to give. But we have actually worked with people who have been told to volunteer a certain number of hours, like as part of their tithe, or not, maybe that's inappropriate language, right? Like you mentioned, but part of maybe they have to be right with God, or that they're not doing a good job being part of the community if they're not, volunteering a certain number of hours a week.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a red flag as well. Those are kinds of issues you just can't quantify. James says faith without works is dead, and he's not contradicting Paul, as some have claimed, because Paul talks about neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything but faith working through love. And I think it's completely appropriate for a Christian leader to say, if you claim to be a believer, but you are not doing anything that a Martian who learned the language and landed on Earth could come and, as an outside observer, say, there is something about this person's commitment of time. I mean, use the cliche of the 3 T's of talent, of treasure, that is any different from Joe Blow, who sits home on Sunday morning and watches ESPN all day or whatever. Then I will never play God and say you're not a Christian, but you ought to ask yourself some soul-searching questions about that. But once I start to quantify that, so that means you must give 10% of your salary. That means you must give X number of hours in volunteer work. And I bet it doesn't count if you volunteer for some other Christian ministry. It has to be for me, for us. Those are the red flags to watch out for. Oh, you've got a talent. You're a great quilter. Well, then, X% of your quilts had better go to our congregation. And not that we have anybody who needs them, but we'll just sell them, make money, and put yeah, watch out for that stuff.
Yeah. Now, do you see this model in the Old Testament of people being asked to give certain amounts, tithing being one of the words that's used, as that's how maybe modern day organizations are saying this is in the Old Testament, that's why we have to quantify it, we have to do it this way?
That's where it originally comes from. And as we talked about on the other podcast, what's often missed is that there were 3 tithes, and one of them was every 3 years for the poor, and eventually that got prorated so that the faithful Israelite, by the time you get up to Malachi, when he says bringing all the tithes and offerings into the storehouse, offering meant something in addition to the 23 1/3%. And so it would be good to ask anybody who refers to that text if they are, in fact, personally giving generously above 23 1/3%. And if not, they've got no right to be asking anybody else to do it.
Consistency. That's a key indicator.
They don't have any right anyway, since you have to filter the Old Testament through the New Testament. But sometimes it's easier to start with the question of consistency.
Excellent. We've got another question related to spiritual abuse and marriage is here. So this person said, my husband is still part of the group, assuming a healthy religious group, but I am not. If my husband is continuing to behave in a way that I perceive as spiritually abusive and he does not, is that grounds for divorce based on abuse? I mean, we kind of talked about this a little bit already. Should I hold on hope that I can positively influence my husband to leave the group and come to recognize that his behavior is spiritually abusive?
I would hope that if there's the slightest glimmer of a flicker of the possibility of hope, that's what she would cling on to. There are times we talked about a little bit on the podcast where I don't think that the 21st century church has done a good job reflecting on all of the intermediate options that there are between staying in an unhealthy marriage with no change at one end and divorce at the other end of the spectrum. My wife and I have done individually and together a fair bit of premarital and marital counseling, and the number of times we have heard somebody say, I just can't stay in this marriage the way it currently is. And our response is, I agree, absolutely. Oh, so then I can get a divorce. No, wait a minute. Nobody said anything about that. We agree that the marriage can't stay the way it is. Well, what are the other dozen options in between that and divorce? Who are the people informally, pastorally, clinically, professional counseling, legal people who could come alongside somebody's best friend from childhood who can get their ear in a way that nobody else can? Have you really exhausted all of the possibilities? Has one person said, why don't we draw some different boundaries? What does that mean? Maybe it means I don't do certain things with you because I'm not comfortable doing them. Maybe it means we have separate checkbooks when we haven't been. Maybe it means I don't spend time with some of your friends because I don't find them healthy. Maybe it means we need to live apart for a little while. It is true that most legal separations eventually wind up in divorce, but they don't all do. And there are some people who that is the final shock that has the effect of waking them up that they need to make changes in their lives. And if the aggrieved party can do all of that with as much of a quiet and kind spirit rather than in a shouting match, and yet without giving in to the other person. If I realize I need to establish boundaries, then I'm reminded of an incident in Colorado years ago where some Catholic nuns were protesting outside of a military base. I don't even remember what the protest was about, but they chained themselves to the fence, and people had to come and saw off the chains and carted them off to jail. And they just let it all happen with the most loving spirit and praying and forgiving their people. But they didn't relinquish their protest. Well, that's remarkable. The Amish who forgive the serial murderer who comes in and blows up the church, and do so with an amazingly loving spirit, not in any sense condoning it, and they're immediately trying to change their boundaries so their church becomes more protected. But when you hear of such stories, you realize that God, through his Spirit, can empower people for great possibilities. No, I'm sorry. As long as you're a member in good standing with this abusive group, I'm going to have to live in a separate place. Well, maybe then that person says, right, I'm out of here, and they initiate the divorce. And then, sadly, but happily too, I'm not the one who had to take the initiative and struggle with all the issues surrounding that. But I could give you names and addresses if I had permission to do so, of people who've tried that, and it did finally work. And then they had wonderful, happy marriages, at least to the extent that anybody does.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Blomberg. That was a beautiful representation of it. There is another way. There can be another way. There can be other options, to not lose hope, to, if there are other options, to try those, to exhaust those before divorce, for sure. Wow. Well, we've spent the last 45 minutes in a great conversation, great Q&A. Dr. Blomberg, so thankful for taking the time today to answer these questions. For all of you out there listening, again, make sure to check out the conversation that Dr. Blomberg has with Naomi that will be released on the podcast and YouTube, I believe, soon. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you so much, Blomberg. Really appreciate having you here.
You're very welcome.
Jump off the call, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Great. Well, for all of you those still listening, thanks again for being here today and supporting this great work. We could not do this without you. So please, if you have it, on your mind and heart that this work matters, we want you to be part of our team. I encourage you to go to our new website, check it out, donate, and make sure this work keeps going. We will be announcing when these episodes come out, and we will be continuing to move this mission forward. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your day and a happy weekend.